Okay, do you think having a preamp, in addition to what you might be using with your interface, are they preamps built into your interface?
Like using a external preamp versus the one that just comes with my interface.
Right. Do you think that makes a big difference? Do you think it like really, steps up your game?
Yeah. Yeah, short answer. Very much does. I
Okay,
mean,
why?
well, think about the manufacturing processes and stuff like that. It's weird to talk about it as the cart following the horse in this sense, but like when they're building an interface, they're doing their best to pick a preamp that meets a certain spec. And they're doing their best to build it at a price point. They're doing their best to build it in a way that works in the big picture and fits inside this box and gives you all these other features and stuff like that. I'm thinking of a specific interface in particular where they have two really good preamps. They have good dynamic range, but the rest of the interface, there's a to D converter in there. There's a D to A converter in there. They have some internal routing that you can do headphones. You can do separate monitor volume, and all of that's in this one box that's powered off a USB bus. And then compare that to a Class A compressor like a Neve 10 series, like a 1072, 1070, whatever, 1066, whatever, some classic Neve variant, right? Um, they're powering that with a 24-volt rail. There's no 24-volt in the USB bus. It's 5 volts. There's serious chunks of iron in there for the transformers. There's just a lot more dedicated circuitry that is built to tailor the sound. And I mean, in the end, they're doing two things. They're raising the level of a microphone. There's impedance matching and stuff like that happens as well. They're raising the level of a microphone up to what they call line level. So microphone level isn't strong enough to push all the way through the system. It's an oversimplification, but the preamp is bringing that level up to line level. So in a interface, they have a lot bigger checklist besides the quality of the preamp that goes into it. Their basic job is bring microphone up to line level, and then they check that box and they move on. And some companies will care more, or some companies have this institutional knowledge of, we know how to make preamps in a cool way, so we're going to package that in our interface, and you get this better preamp in this package of interface. But it's still not the institutional knowledge of someone who has made a preamp for 60 years or 50 years or however long, but all their effort is building this preamp to do this job in a very beautiful musical way. It's a much more robust device that is doing the simple job of bringing a microphone level up to a line level, and so the result is invariably better. Short answer, yes, it's better to have a preamp before you go into your interface. And then, just to be clear, at that point, you want to make sure you're taking line level into your interface. You don't want to make the mistake of going into a preamp and then plugging it into the microphone amp of your interface. You want to bypass the microphone preamp of your interface and go straight in line level, and that way all you're using from your interface is the A to D converter.
Nice. That's very helpful. And so, what else can a preamp add other than like the gain? Like, what sort of characteristics? What sort of
Yeah.
potentially?
Well, I mean, that's a good one, because it's like a forest with all these different trees in it, and the oak tree has this advantage: it can canopy out and it can reach and catch a whole bunch of sunlight, and it can make shade underneath, which prevents other trees from growing underneath it. And the pine tree goes straight and tall and get above the canopy. So you can have this forest with all these different trees in it, but they've evolved for different reasons. So an API preamp evolved because they were working with this set of parameters. They were trying to use this op amp into this transformer, and they were trying to make it fit into this kind of console. You go back to like the vintage Neve, the early days of Rupert Neve's designs. He was making stuff for the government, and so it was like military specifications, and they had to be able to drop it out of a plane and drive it on a Jeep. And so he was building these things to do a job in a beautiful musical way, but also they were very robust. There's a reason why those things are sought after today, is because you can drop them out of a plane and they'll still work. SSL, when they were doing their thing in the 80s, they were trying to make a beautiful, useful preamp, but they were also trying to make a channel strip that included equalization and compression and this crazy routing and stuff like that. So I'm not saying they had to make compromises. I'm saying they were doing the best they could within the form factor that they had. And so all these factors go into it, to the design of it, the what they call the operational amps, the op amps. If it's the topologies, is it tube, is it solid state, is it class A? All these little nuances that go into how it's built. Sometimes those are determined by, it has to fit in a box this big, it has to be able to jump out of an airplane, it has to cost $100, or whatever the demands are of the constraints of the design. They're doing their best to make the end result come out of those constraints. And so everybody had different reasons for competition. The pine tree was trying to grow taller so it can get to the sunlight. The oak tree is trying to grow wider so it can choke out all the other trees. And so every one of them has their thing, but it's because of these design constraints. And so we, in the end, get to use them because of that beautiful result.
And so I noticed some of them have like, some of like I think I saw a newer Neve one that had like a silk function on it. What does that do?
So that's from what I understand, I mean, it's turn the knob and listen and go, oh, this sound better or worse? Better or worse? Better or worse? You'd have to speak to the engineers who designed it to get specific, but in my experience of messing with that particular model, it's changing a harmonic. It's adding a harmonic, or it's exciting a harmonic at a certain point that it adds a color to the sound. It's very subtle.
It's a sort of saturation.
It can be it can be described as saturation. Yeah, but it's a subtle thing that speaks to this. To extend my wood analogy, it might be like poplar. If you stain it this way, it starts to look like oak, and if you stain it this way, it starts to look like cypress, or what. You know what I mean? And so it's this basic topology of a preamp that now has some flexibility in its harmonic output, its harmonic structure. And that's something that's kind of evolved over the years, because in the early days you were working with one set of components, you'd put them together in a certain way, and you generally got that result. Now, you would still kind of fish through the tolerances of a bunch of components. You'd have a box of capacitors that are all supposed to be, I don't know what the numbers are, 10 microfarads. And you'd measure, and this one's 9.8, this one's 9.9, this one's 11. So you'd measure them all, and you'd find the ones that were exactly 10, and you'd pull those out, and you'd build your preamps with those. So that you had a real consistent build. Lesser concerned companies would just put whatever component was in there. So you'd have one preamp that had a 9 microfarad capacitor in it, and one that had an 11. And so two pieces of the same exact model of equipment sounded pretty different. And so it's only the manufacturers who really cared about building to within a certain tolerance that had a very consistent output over and over and over again. And so sometimes they would find, like, in this year, it's like vintages of wine, these capacitors were all made within this tolerance range, and so consequently the high end sounds really great on this year's worth of equipment or whatever. And so you might try to recreate that in the future. And now we don't have access to that vintage of component, but we can use some kind of trickery in the circuit to recreate that sound. And suppose you don't want it, then turn it off, turn it on, and now you can hear. And that's really, when a manufacturer puts that kind of stuff into a piece of equipment, my only advice is don't worry about how it's built or what it's doing. Listen to it. Turn off the computer and blow up the Death Star. Just close your eyes and listen. Better, worse, better, worse, worse, better.
So in summation, yes, preamp, external preamp.
Yes, in summation, an external preamp 99% of the time is going to be better than the preamp that comes with the... Now, that said, I have, everything sounds like something. So I have had times where the interface, I'm hesitant to talk about it, but the Digi 001, the first home Pro Tools that they made, the preamp in that thing, it had two preamps in the front of it, sounded fantastic on kick drum, but I really didn't like it on anything else. And so even though I had all these great outboard preamps, I would still use that one on the kick drum sometimes, or maybe that one in addition to something else with the kick drum. So don't discount what the interface's preamp sounds like, because it might be useful. It might be a good preamp to use, but learn it and kind of memorize the timbre, memorize the fingerprint that that particular piece has. And then when you go to match it to something else, match it to a microphone, match it to a sound, you kind of have it in your palette as one of the colors you can pick from. So don't discount it as, oh, well, you know, this is a preamp that comes with the interface. It's not going to be any good. Everything sounds like something. So figure out what it's good for and then, you know, use it that way.
Do you have what kind of preamp do you typically reach for here in your studio?
One that turns the microphone level up to a line level.
No, but don't you have like what do you use?
I have a ton. Yeah, I have a ton of different. I tend to think in terms of topology, so I have some tube stuff. I have some Class A kind of vintage Neve type stuff. I have some modern versions of that. They tend to be quieter. They tend to have a nicer dynamic range, but they're built along the same topology. So I know I'm going to get a little bit of ring and resonance from the transformer. I know I'm going to get a particular rise time or slew rate or damping factor out of the op amp or the front end of the preamp. I tend to think in terms of topologies more than like this brand or whatever, but invariably, you know, the Neve stuff tends to be along the lines of really good Class A transformer-y sounds. API tends to be right in the middle of like really beautiful mid-range and tremendously strong and quick low end with a nice open top. And then, you know, something like, you know, a Trident tends to have a stronger upper mid-range and maybe a little bit thinner bottom, but it's got a nice strong upper mid-range. And then, you know, something like a Avalon or a Grace or you know, those kinds of things tend to have a more pristine top end and you know, kind of a clinical or more linear mid-range and low end. And so I just think of it in terms of like, what device am I using in relation to what microphone and what's my source? What's the end product going to be? And it's like a mix and match between what's the source, what's the microphone, what's the preamp, what's the result.
Okay, real quick. What's your favorite tree?
Cypress.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in today. We appreciated having you.
Having me in my own studio.
Yeah.